I'm going to talk to you about some part of my PhD work entitled Replication Validity of Biomedical Findings Reported by Newspaper. Some of it has been recently published in PLOS ONE. According to the National Science Board, a third of Americans say they rely on scientific information in online newspaper or in print. So it's still basic journalism from which they learn information about science and technology. So I think it's still really important to see what scientific studies are covered by newspaper, what makes them newsworthy. In order to study this, we use the database my colleague just described, and this has two advantages. First, we have more than 5,000 studies, and for each of those, we know the replication validity. So we decided to look at each of these studies to find out which one had been selected by journalists. We decided as well to investigate 3 different factors which we thought might impact the journalist's choice. First, it's a type of study. Is this an initial study on a subject or a subsequent study on the same topic? The type of association, and we distinguished 2 types. The first one was lifestyle type associations, such as risk factor on which the subject can act, for example, smoking or red meat consumption. The second type was the non-lifestyle type, which are risk factors such as genetic markers or brain imaging studies. And finally, we looked at the impact of the journal, the impact factor of the journal in which the study has been published. So we have 4,723 studies, of which 156 were covered. This is 3.3%, which is not bad to study this topic. And these were covered in more than almost 1,500 newspaper articles. Each study, so the lowest number of newspaper articles for each study was 1, and the highest was 50. But on average, we had like 9 newspaper articles per study. In contrast, the 306 meta-analyses we've got, just 5 were covered by newspaper, and we just had 86 different newspaper articles. So meta-analysis, even if they are still, if we think of them as the best estimate of a true effect in a risk factor and a pathology, are unseen and uncovered, underreported by journalists. But what makes a study newsworthy? First, of course, it's being an initial study, as 13% of all the initial study in our database are covered, when just 2.4 of the subsequent study are. Second, if there are studies dealing with lifestyle risk factor, 10% of them are covered, and just 2.3% for the non-lifestyle. Let's look at this graph. So we plotted the impact factor, low, medium, or high, against the percentage of covered study. You can still see that initial non-lifestyle study in green are highly covered. Lifestyle study are covered too. And this we can see this for low and medium impact factor. But if we look at high impact factor, the type of study or the type of the association doesn't seem to play a role anymore. It's more where the study has been published, because here subsequent studies are covered. But as we heard, there's this replication crisis. So are those studies replicated? This is what we look at. And same here, you have the impact factor, low, medium, high, against replication validity. So initial non-lifestyle studies are really poorly replicated. Lifestyle study, in contrast, I mean, they are not very better, but at least it's consistent across all impact factor, and it's around 50%. But for a non-lifestyle subsequent study, in blue, the replication validity is much higher, as high as 88% in high impact factor journal. So bearing in mind, or keeping in mind this poor reproducibility of the studies covered in newspaper, we wonder what study were interesting for journalists. Did they cover null finding? Do they cover contradictory study? Do they follow up on a topic they've covered before? So what we saw is journalists almost always cover positive findings, because in our database, we had initial studies, 53 of them were covered. None were covering null findings, despite the fact that in the database, more than 40% of our initial studies were presenting negative results. If we look at subsequent studies, 14 of them were covered. 14 of the subsequent studies covered by newspaper were dealing with null findings, but we had just 5% of the whole newspaper article. So even if they are covered less often, and there's less coverage for them. But what about contradictory study? We only find one case in our whole database, which we had one study, which was covered in 50 newspaper articles, and then this study was invalidated. And this invalidation was mentioned in 4 newspaper articles. I have to say that both of these studies were published in high impact factor journal, more than 30. So that might explain why this contradictory study was highlighted in newspaper. It is often hypothesized that journalists don't speak about null finding or contradictory study because they are not published in prominent journal, so they can't see them. So we decided to investigate this. In order to do that, we took all the study which were covered by newspaper, and we looked if any subsequent study on the same topic were contradicting these results and were published in a journal with an impact factor above 10. 69% of the study published, covered by journalists, didn't have any contradictory study published in high impact factor journal. So journalists couldn't have seen them, even if they are not replicated. But for 31% of the covered study, we could find contradictory study which were published in journal with an impact factor high enough for them to be seen by journalists. But yet, just one of them was covered. So our study shows that first, journalists preferentially cover initial study, and second, that those studies are, like in the scientific literature, poorly validated. We've also shown that journalists rarely cover negative or null finding, and they don't follow up on invalidation about the studies they have previously covered. So finally, journalists, by selecting initial studies, and scientists, by pushing the publication of their results in prestigious journals, are equally complicit of the poor information presented to the public in the press. I would like to thank the people I work with in Bordeaux and in Bristol, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Estelle. Are you ready for some questions? Yeah. There's the first one.
Hi, my name's Brian Nosek. Thanks, this was fascinating data, and there was an interesting pattern I wonder if you can unpack a little bit in the subsequent studies of the non-lifestyle, or yeah. I think that's right, where there was increasing replicability with the higher impact factor of the journal. Have you unpacked that at all to see if it is the case that for subsequent studies to get published in a higher impact factor journal, they have to be much more definitive, much larger samples, much stronger, so that they will be more reproducible in the end?
I don't know about that. I was more thinking because, I've got a lot of them, so I can't talk about every one of them. But sometimes I've seen that subsequent studies published in high impact factor journal were done in huge university or with huge collaboration. So I don't know if it's we wanted to investigate if, having a study presented by Harvard doesn't get better chance to get published in high impact factors than another one which might be just as good, but not from such a big league university. So I can't answer your question more than this.
Hi, my name is Bram Dux from Maastricht University. I really like your study and the results you have shown, but I wonder how much it's the journalists that are to blame if they select articles from high-impact journals and initial articles and positive articles, because I can also imagine that it's actually universities that give a press release when there are articles in high-impact journals or when they are positive.
Yes, that's true. So I think the blame is to share, and but I've done some interview with journalists, just a few, and it's funny the way they say it's so important to be very cautious when they present research and when they talk about it in the media and the way they're doing it, and most of the time they blame on their editors, which are more pushy for the title and everything, and they try to get it like low-key, but they don't succeed. And sometimes it's the researchers, the scientists, which are pushing the results, who are pushing the results. So no, it's not just their fault, but they can't find out about studies when there's no press release as well. So I guess, press release help, but they find out about some studies, even if there's no press release.
Have you looked into the press releases as well?
We wanted to do that. We tried, but the thing is, I think you can't get press release before 2004, and many of the initial studies we've got in our database are before that. But most of them, I have some preliminary data on this. So most of them had press release, but if it's not because you've got a press release that you will be in newspaper as well, because some of them had and they were uncovered, even if it was high impact factor journal, even if it was positive results.
Thank you.
Mr. Gunn.
So I just have a modest proposal, and this may not be entirely feasible right now, but perhaps the journalist should look to see if a article has been pre-registered before they publish on it, and maybe only do these kind of high-impact lifestyle things if there's already been a pre-registered report out there for it.
The thing is, because they are on tight deadline, and I think they can't do that because they're not just covering lifestyle studies, they're covering maybe earth science or climate change. So I don't think they have the time when they got the press release and they have to really write the story in 6 hours to check all of this. And their main focus is to get scientists to talk about the subject. So.
Yeah. I'll just say I have zero sympathy for the time pressures that journalists face. If they don't have time enough to do the due diligence, then maybe consider just, not writing the article.
I think you were first, but we probably have time for your question as well.
Andrew Gray from Auckland. In the initial news coverage of the initial publications, were you able to assess how frequently there was reports of the fact that it was the first observation and yes, limitations thereof? Because we and others have reported that limitations from the journal and that the yes, press release and news report level are very infrequently reported.
We look at this. We took 40 out of the 53 initial study which were covered. We took the 40 with the most different newspaper article number, so that we can have look at the content. The thing is, it's hard to say when they say it's the very first study, if they mean it's the very first study or it's the best one to ever have shown this. So I think it's 70% of the case, they identify the study as being an initial study, but I don't think it means for them that it's initial as preliminary. And we looked as well as if scientists, when they were interviewed, they would say, if this is initial study, preliminary data, and some do, they do mention it, so we can't tell if they mention it everywhere and if it has been cut off. But when it's mentioned, it's because of the scientists. So we can also blame the scientists if it's not written, that maybe they haven't said it. I don't know.
And a final question.
Yeah, Eric Turner from Portland, Oregon. Just wondering, and maybe I missed this, if when you looked at the amount of journalism coverage, did you, there's a phenomenon that I've noticed sometimes where if there's a big outlet that covers it, there's a, what I'll call a monkey see, monkey do phenomenon. And so for instance, if it's covered by the New York Times, then I think then the next day, suddenly everybody's covering it.
Yes.
And they'll even basically plagiarize some of the interviews, and there'll be outlets that'll show up, and I never spoke with those people, but there's the quote from some other interview, and you might see that getting multiplied. So I wondered if that got taken into account with your methods when you quantified the number of, reports that were basically copies versus.
No. Sometimes we have two reports on two different days in the New York Times, for example, and if the title was different and the text was a bit different, we decided to consider as two. But some were exactly the same, but what you said is true, so most of the time, and it's from Reuters, usually they copy and paste, but they add some stuff in it, some one or two lines. So at one point I was thinking, should I look for how plagiarism is it, like how percent of what is the percentage of it being the same? But there were like 1,000 newspaper articles, so I gave up. And from what I see, yes, you can see the monkey. I don't know how you call it, the monkey.
Monkey see, monkey do.
Yeah. So we could see
Copycat.
that. We could see that. Yeah. But we still counted it as one.